Hi, I'm James Vowles. I'm the Motorsport Strategy Director for the team, and I'm here to answer your questions about the Monaco Grand Prix. Some of you asked why we left Lewis out on those medium tyres, which were clearly performing worse than the hard. The reality in Monaco is you won't overtake. So even though we had the hard tyres ready in the pit lane to fit the car, if we had to do a pit stop at any point, we would have just been fourth out of the 4 cars in that train. You can't overtake. You saw that with Max Verstappen trying really aggressively against Lewis. So perhaps the bigger question is, why did we fit the medium tyres to Lewis? And to answer that, we need to go all the way back to Thursday. We were one of the top teams to have both medium and soft available to long run in FP2, the second practice session, and the track conditions were slightly worse than they were going to be in the race, but still representative enough to understand how the tyres were performing. On those long runs that we did on medium, we were able to see that their life would just about make what we needed to in the race to achieve the stints that happened when the safety car came out. And that's what triggered our decision. In Monaco, you typically want the softest rubber that you can get away with for the stint length that you're trying to get to. And we knew it would be tight. We knew it would need a lot of management, but believed, based on the Thursday data, that the medium tyre would do the job. The second reason why we fitted the medium tyre was there was a chance of rain during the race. If you could see our weather radar, you would have seen the sea of blue come in from the east towards the circuit. Now, it actually broke up. There was a very little bit of light rain during the race, but we had forecasted that there were going to be slightly heavier rain than that. Not enough to go to inters, but enough to be very difficult on dry tyres. And the medium may well have provided slightly more coverage in those conditions, being a slightly softer compound. And that's why we erred towards that slightly softer medium tyre. There's a question over why we double stacked the cars in Monaco during that safety car. If you can stop under a safety car in Monaco, it's really the best of all worlds. From lap 11, we knew we could take the tyres to the end of the race. We believed the medium, but the hard would have easily made it as well. And our competitors, Vettel and Verstappen, knew this too. That's why they came in. If you stay out, if you look at this race planner as an example, this was the real race. And now imagine Valtteri's at the front of that queue. So he has track position, he has clear air in front of him, but that soft tyre was already starting to become damaged on the front left. And more so than the medium, it would have fallen apart far, far quicker. And the reality behind it is that as you look across the race on the x-axis, left to right is laps increasing, he never would have pulled a gap to the 3 cars behind. And ultimately, when he took his pit stop, which could be right at the end, he would drop into P4 behind those cars. So he's now lost positions. So for Valtteri, you don't want to do that if you can at all avoid it. So you need to come in during a safety car. When you come in for a double stack safety car, what's really important is making a gap between your cars so that the first car can be serviced in the pit lane and the second one can slot straight in. And Valtteri did that perfectly on track. Lewis had his pit stop, drove out, and you would have seen Valtteri came straight back in again. And now it's a straight race between Vettel, Verstappen and Valtteri for a pit stop. Unfortunately, as Lewis left, he clipped one of the guns, and it took just a few seconds for them to reset properly. And the cost to us was a couple of tenths. That's it, but that's all you need. We had a couple of tenths loss on Valtteri's pit stop. Red Bull had a very, very good pit stop, one of the best of the year for them. And those extremes meant that as the cars went out and were in the pit lane, Verstappen came alongside, hit the left-hand side of Valtteri's car, pushing the right-hand side into the wall and damaging that front right wheel, which is what you can see in this picture. Now, this image is obviously post-race. Live, we can see tyre pressures, and we had a quick look at them to see what was going on. And after a few corners, when Valtteri was back out on track, it became evident that we had a problem. We were starting to lose pressure, and we had to react then and there to bring Valtteri straight back in. If we waited any longer, Valtteri would have been last. We brought Valtteri back in the pit lane, fitted the hard tyre, which was the best of the tyres not known at the time, and then he rejoined back in P4. We have some questions about why the rear tyres look to be in a good condition, but the fronts less so from Lewis's car on Sunday. We knew from Thursday's running that all of the tyres were wearing down pretty equally. The front and the rear axle were working fairly well, and the rubber was being worn away in equal measures for every lap that you did. What happened on the front wasn't a normal tyre behaviour. We're actually starting to tear it apart and use it far, far quicker than you normally would. Had that not happened, actually all tyres would have worn down very nicely. It would have still been difficult for Lewis in the closing laps, but everything would have been okay. It's that tearing that created the problem. And when that happens, you don't use the rubber normally anymore. You start really shearing it off the surface and it disappears very, very quickly. And with 20 laps to go, it was clear that Lewis didn't have much tyre remaining on the front at all and had to really look after it. What he then started doing, and you can see it on the video, is he had to use the rear axle to turn the car. You would have seen him, especially in lows, turning the car a lot more aggressively on the rear tyres, using what was left on that rubber to keep the car going in the right direction. He wore the rear down, but still had enough remaining at the end of the race to have the traction to keep Verstappen behind. The difference between the hard tyre and the medium tyre was the hard was just a little bit more resistant to that tearing on the front left. If you looked at the TV during the race, you would have seen a little bit of this tearing on the front left of Verstappen's car, but nowhere near as bad as Lewis's. And the reality behind it is that's the extra security that tyre provided you. It's just in a little bit of a better state. And as a result of it, you could push much, much harder for more laps in the race. The tyres were really on the limit at the end of the race, that front left especially. And had the race been one more lap, I'm pretty sure we would have been in trouble. And ideally for me, I would have liked the race to be about 20 laps shorter. On Thursday, we did our homework, and we're one of very few of the top teams to do our homework. We had that medium tyre, and we ran it in FP2, the afternoon session, which temperature-wise was very similar to the race. And we put a number of laps in it to try and understand how it was wearing, how we were using it, and what forecast of laps you could do in the race. And from our homework, it came out that you could do the stints we were asking it to do in the race with a lot of management. The reality behind it is that that work was incorrect. We didn't go into the race being able to enjoy those lives. And that front left tyre really started tearing itself apart much earlier than we had anticipated, making life very difficult. We were on the limit. I think there's no question about that. The hard tyre was the right tyre to fit. It gave you more resistance to that problem. And had we had the hard tyre, Lewis's race would have been much, much easier. Lewis and Valtteri are the experts in the car and can feel exactly what's going on at every single point, both with the car and the tyres. We have data, and a lot of it, and it tells us what's, for example, happening in the power unit, what's happening in the brakes, and what's happening on the tyres. But ultimately, Lewis and Valtteri are in the hot seat. They really know what's happening and can control what's happening furthermore. Lewis's feedback is invaluable to us. It really helps us guide what is going on and actually correlate it to the data. And I would much rather he talks to me every single lap about what's happening, what his concerns are, and what we can do to help him, rather than hold it in and not let us know what's really happening behind the scenes. Lewis could clearly see that that front left wasn't going to hold up, and he was right. And it allowed us to already take action. What do we do? What if it disappears? What pit stops do we do? What can we tune on the car? And see how much we can help him get to the end of the race. Valtteri was on that hard tyre after the second pit stop, behind Vettel. Now, the difference between Verstappen and Lewis was that Verstappen had that hard tyre. He had a tyre advantage, and he took advantage of it. He tried to pummel Lewis lap after lap to get his medium tyres to completely disappear. Valtteri wasn't in that same circumstance against Vettel. Vettel had exactly the same tyres. And if Valtteri had been on his gearbox every single lap, nothing would have happened. In fact, typically it's the car behind that would have suffered because you lose the downforce. Furthermore, the power unit was just running a little bit hot. Valtteri's the fourth of 4 cars in a queue, and you start losing the clean air by the time you get there. So the best thing Valtteri could do is this. Priority 1, make sure he's within 5 seconds of Verstappen by the end of the race to make sure he can pick up those points. 2, make sure that he gets the car to the end of the race in the best way he possibly can. And that's exactly what Valtteri did. There was very little point in him pressuring Vettel otherwise in the race. Thank you very much again for all of your questions. It's been a pleasure answering them, and we look forward to answering your questions about the Canadian Grand Prix.